Hi. I wanted to continue our theme of talking about self-sabotage, things that can be set up inside uh, to keep the programming going, but also to keep the person away from God. That's the focus of today's um, lesson. So one of the things I try to do is look for what habits in the person's daily life might be feeding their soul more than their spirit. Not that everything is wrong or off limits. Just look for an imbalance. Like if they constantly have a television on, then they're not going to experience any stillness, and they're not going to really tap into what they're feeling or what's going on. And so that can be a habit that keeps them from furthering their healing because they're distracting themselves from knowing what's going on. Secular music can be another one. So in today's example, I asked this man to consider doing a fast from secular music because he had constantly for years just been playing music all day. And it's hard. He said it is hard to not have a distraction because he doesn't like the way he feels, and music helps him feel better. And music is supposed to help us feel better. In the Bible, when Saul was being tormented by demons, David came and played music and it made the spirits flee. So it's supposed to do that. But there's a difference between music that heals us and is glorifying the Lord, and music that the world has that can reprogram. Songs are used in programming a lot. For example, the Beatles have a song about Lucy and the diamond in the sky, and that's actually about Lucifer, and it's a program to keep people's diamonds, the gems, the diamonds connected to Lucifer. So that programming gets reinforced when people listen to that song. But it doesn't have to be something like that. It can be like a fun song. There's an old, I think it's a 50s song about lollipops. And that one is used to teach little girls to perform sexual acts. And it's supposed to reinforce that kind of programming. So it can be really nefarious in the programming that it's reinforcing without sounding like that. And so since we don't know what songs were used for what programs and the people, sometimes it's good just to take a break. Let's see, how does your spirit respond when you take a break? What changes for you? What are you noticing? What feelings come up for you? And again, it's only according to what they can tolerate. So we had done some of that, and we had he'd asked, could we please address the difficulty that he's experiencing in getting into the Lord's presence and hearing the Lord's voice. And I had asked him to do a collage about it, and he just wasn't able to. It was so intense. The emotions were so intense that he couldn't even pick pictures about it. And some of that is the emotional issues, but some of that is the resistance of the programming, because there's some powerful spirits connected to the programs that keep us away from God. And it's no problem. You know, if they can do a collage, it's great. If they don't do a collage, okay. It's just a tool. And we want to make sure that they know what we're asking them to do to participate in the healing process is a question, it's a suggestion, it's not a demand. So I'm not demanding that he doesn't listen to music. I'm not demanding a collage. I'm offering ways and tools that we can find out what's going on. Okay, so we started off with a prayer, and in the prayer, I could tell when we were done that he was processing something, and I said, okay, what came up for you during that prayer? And he was kind of shocked that I would ask, but what he was thinking about was he had a cousin that wasn't a Christian, and that said, how can you be connected to Christ and pray for people and people receive healing. And yet, you have parts of you that are still connected to the occult and to darkness. And he said, why do we have to beg from God for things? This is what the cousin said. It shouldn't have to be that way. And that kind of told me that he was already processing an internal belief about God being someone in power that withheld things. And so that gave me a clue of where we needed to kind of direct our questions. And so I asked him, what color in you identifies with needing to beg from God and not getting what you're asking for? Is there a color? And he said he saw a lot of colors, like a flash of a lot of colors. And I said, well, that can be true. It can be a lot of you that might feel this way. It doesn't have to be just one. So I said, who in your life had a position of power and felt like you felt like you had to beg for any kind of attention or whatever you wanted? Who was a dominating force in your life? And he was seeing flashes of those colors again, and he said it's like the colors of a peacock, but they're all metallic. And there's lots of colors. And so when he said metallic, I knew that we had some metals happening here. And when he brought up his cousin, I knew we had some generational stuff happening. And so I just asked the Lord to remove any introjects. So parts of other people or spirits, whatever, that are introjecting to be part of whatever's going on. And he could feel a shift. He saw some metals leave. So that told me, okay, so this is some high-level programming where other people's metals were given roles to keep this kind of programming in place. So that told me that there were some entities in charge. And he said the colors then seem to represent a stadium full of parts. So whenever there's something that big, there's a lot of trauma. Something has split the person in thousands and thousands and thousands of parts. And so I knew we were going to go gently. He was a little frustrated that it was coming in bits and pieces. He wanted more of the story. But because of the size of what was being revealed and already the resistance to it, I knew we needed to just take our time and let him know he was okay, that what was happening was unfolding in layers and it's on purpose. So just be okay with where you are. So we did some talking to just let the parts know we understand this was something that was very big for them. And that there's fear of showing too much at once. And so we prayed that perfect love would come and that it would just remove the fear and the terror. And he said, he goes, I just remembered, because his grandfather had passed away that week. And he had asked me, do I need to pray anything? Because my grandfather passed away. Because his grandfather was a very cruel man who laughed at evil and loved it. So in the spirit realm, when somebody is in the occult, and especially if they have a high position in the occult, they are going to leave a spiritual inheritance for the family members that are left behind. So they're going to kind of take the bondage that they have, and they're going to spiritually pass it down to those in the family line. And so I had told him, yes, you do need to be aware of what to pray. And I told him, how to pray. And he remembered just then, he goes, oh, I never prayed that prayer that you sent me about my grandfather. So that kind of told me that the grandfather was involved in the bondage that we were going to discuss. and that there was a lot of resistance to praying anything to disconnect from him. And that helped me understand there's a lot of terror and fear connected to the grandfather and removing any programming that was put in place. And so I asked him, did he want to pray that right then? And he said, yeah. So we prayed that there would be no spiritual inheritance passed down to him through the generations, that no demonic entities or any kind of human spirits would be allowed to connect to him, and that the grandfather would not be able to live on through him, because that's another common thing that happens in the occult is people that pass on have done rituals and taken vows and forced the ones underneath them to say, yes, you can live on through me. So we prayed that away, and we recognized that the grandfather was the one who had put the barrier between him and God. And the grandfather had actually put this programming in. And this was news to him, because he was already understanding that bondage had come from one side of the family line, but this was the other side of the family line. So this was different. Like, he knew his grandfather was cruel and wasn't a godly man, but he didn't understand that his grandfather was programming him. So he started to feel dizzy and sick. He felt like somebody had hit him on the back of the head, and he was dizzy. And that could be because that's an experience that he had had when programming was being put in, because that does happen. They do cause intense brain trauma on purpose by hitting you on the head. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that happened. So I just prayed against programming, prayed that the Lord would wash away the body memory and the confusion that came with it. And also I prayed against any powers of Zeus, because to me, spinning, dizziness, those kinds of things, they can be directly connected to Zeus. So dizziness can be a sign of witchcraft coming at you. And it can be a sign of programming being triggered inside. They do use dizziness as a way to put programming in, because it disorients you and you want to do anything to make it stop. So they do use dizziness to actually attach entities. So when I started praying away entities, and I asked the Lord that any entities that were connected to each other would be separated from each other, and that they would be separated from any kind of structure that they were holding together, and that his parts would be separated from the entities, separated from the grandfather, and also separated from siblings and cousins that may have been involved in this, because he was talking about they all grew up in the same house. The grandfather had access to them as well. So we just started kind of pulling the thread wherever we got information, and we were loosening the weave of this bondage. Well, Jesus was. Okay, so he felt like maybe he was going on a rabbit trail when he told me this story, but I know that information can come from different levels of the person's being, and different parts can have different connections and pieces of the story. So I don't feel like it's a distraction or a rabbit trail. I feel like it's telling me something. If it ends up not relating to what we're talking about, it's telling me there's a distraction program going on, because there's some tension or fear happening. So whatever they're saying is going to tell me something. But this time it actually did have to do with what was going on. He had a memory of his grandfather actually telling him a story of how he had violently abused an adult man for days and kept him chained up and had beat him. And so even if the grandfather had never done that kind of activity to this man, just speaking that story is saying, I am a dominant force. I get what I want. You had better do what I say. Anybody that crosses me is going to end up like this. And so that can instill some incredible fear inside. And he told stories of how the grandfather had dominated the dad as well. And so I knew there was a pattern here. There was generational domination through the grandfather. And so we just kept praying. Everything that he brought up, we were praying each step of the way. I like to, if I can, when something's this big, try and lessen it little by little with the prayers. Instead of all the tension building and the story building, and it's so much emotion all at once, instead of like building it to a level that's too hard for him to tolerate. So I like to get a little bit of freedom as we go, to try and lessen the pressure on him. So as we were praying off the domination and the fear and the things like that, he saw that the stadium actually looked like a Roman Coliseum. And there were parts of him that were chained to pillars in the center. And that was just like what the grandfather had done to the other man. And so I knew that we were on the right track here. And there were parts of him that were just little parts of him that were filling the stadium, that were forced to watch. And then there were parts of him that were forced to do the dominating, like play out the grandfather's role. So a Coliseum is a very typical setting that is put in programming. It can be like lions or beasts tearing apart the Christians. It's all focused on, if you're a Christian, you're going to suffer. So what was happening was this was set up inside his programming. So any parts of his that would reach out to God in prayer, they would be pulled into this Coliseum and beaten by the parts of him. So it really kept him from reaching out to God. Not completely, but it was a huge barrier that he didn't even know. He just would listen to music and go on his day and be frustrated that he hadn't spent a lot of time in prayer. Well, this was why. This was why it was so hard for him to spend a lot of time in dedicated prayer, because parts of him inside were programmed to distract him away from it, because they knew they were going to get punished if he did. And so it was all this conglomeration of parts that were created over time. It wasn't a one-time event, I'm sure. But we asked if the parts had anything that they needed us to know, just a little bit of what set this up. And he could tell that he had been abused, and that he was very scared and dominated by the grandfather. And so I just synchronized with him, and I just told him, I'm so sorry that this has happened, that there was fear in this relationship, and that you were taken advantage of as a child. And this is not your fault. Nothing you did made this happen. It's not your fault that it happened. It's not your fault that this was set up. And it's not your fault that you don't know. The terror was to a level that it made grown men lose control of their body. So it certainly would terrify a little boy. So we started praying, and one interesting thing that I had prayed was, Lord, would you take away any parts of other people? And so there were medals of other people that were there in charge of it. I may have said that already. But what he saw shifting was, he saw parts like standing up and walking out of the stadium, just walking out of the Coliseum. As the truth came, and as the reality of this doesn't have to stay like this, we don't have to continue this kind of program. As that understanding came, and as Jesus himself was coming with his spirit to just wash over them, we prayed that they would be disconnected on a quantum level from any family members that had experienced this. We canceled any threats that if he talked, family members would be harmed, because what he was aware of during the abuse was stay quiet, keep quiet. So this is his don't talk programming, and it's mixed in with don't talk to God. So we canceled the threats that were given to him about the family members being harmed. We canceled any threats internally that parts would have to reprogram. We prayed for the little ones who had to watch that their emotions would be washed and that everyone would be separated on a cellular but on a quantum level, because the emotions of this, the energy was so high. Um, and then we prayed for Jesus to come with the sword of the Spirit and remove the chains of those who were being harmed. And then we asked him to speak to the ones who were in charge of harming and help them lay down their weapons, because the need for this is done. And all of this shifting was happening. And he felt like knives were going into his eyes. It was very painful. And that can be a body memory. They do use instruments to harm the eyes. It's terrifying. So we just prayed that away, and any terror that came with that. And then the parts of him received the healing, and they were filing out of the stadium, and they were going to journey to the Lord. So they were all going as a group to the Father. And we asked the Father to reorient them to truth, to renew their minds, to mature them, to allow them to grow up and be part of the whole again, like God intended in the first place. It's not up to the person to try and minister to each part. That's too much. We just leave that in the Lord's hands. And so then the shift becomes, what does this mean to you if this is true? Because we got to bring it back around to the adult self, who he really thought he didn't have much connection with his grandfather. And we talked about, well, that can be because so much of it was traumatic that you only remember a few times of being with him when it wasn't, because this is some intense trauma. And so he understood that there could be more that he's experienced with this grandfather than what he's remembering. And it's helping him put some dots together. And so I told him, this is a layer of the programming. This is where the grandfather inserted himself in the programming right now. But we could come to other layers where he is. And that doesn't mean that this one is reinforced, and it doesn't mean that you failed if the grandfather shows up again. It's very normal for there to be layers in different parts of the system. And so you're going to be working your way to the root of that connection. And there'll be agreements and renunciations that have to happen along the way. Usually when it's generational like this and it's intense like that, it's spirit wounds. It's deep programming, generational programming. So it takes some time to work through the layers of that. So that was his soul shattering, but it also was his spirit. Some of that was his spirit shattering. And God knows where each part belongs. He knows how to bring healing to them. He knows how to bring them truth. And so there was some sadness and some heaviness, because he realized that his story is deeper than he thought. It's more intricately programmed than he thought. But there was also some hope, because he wants so much to be a light of freedom so that others can get free. And he's a forerunner in his family. And the other people know that they have bondage. They just don't know a way out yet. And it was encouraging to him that he could break this programming off of himself, but that we could also pray that the Lord would extend his grace to his sibling, his cousins, the family members that had experienced this. And we prayed for their hearts to be directed towards God Most High and towards healing. So the hope for him was that he's not going to experience as much internal resistance to connect to God. And as he does that, and as the healing manifests in him, it's going to be a witness to his family members. And that's really encouraging to know that there is purpose in what we went through. There is freedom on the other side of it. There is hope for us, for other people to gain freedom. That helps us assimilate these stories and let them be our story instead of just the story of the parts of us and what they went through.